and welcome to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast. My name is Jesse, and I'll be your host. So on today's episode, we are going to be covering a particular movie that is such a cult film. It's kind of known as one of these first kind of midnight movies. We're gonna, go to the soda shop and run into like a like a guy selling us weed there, like kind of like a weird 30s gangster or something. And then we're also gonna like jump out of a window as well. I don't know. We're gonna do some shit, but today we're going to be covering. We got a little double feature here for you today. We are going to be covering the original movie of Reefer Madness from 1936. And then as a fun companion to it, we have Reefer Madness, the movie musical from 2005. And we'll get into all of that. But for this episode today, I could not do it alone. So I decided to bring on a guest with me today. So this guest you just heard last week on our episode about pink flamingos. And he's been on our episodes for Carnival of Souls before. And he's also been heard on the Movies Made Us Gay podcast a couple different times. But welcome back to the show, Jackson Cooper. Hey, Jackson, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm great. How are you?
Doing great. We're going to just pretend like we didn't just talk to each other 2 days ago. But it's fine. It's fine, guys.
It's all fine. It's all fine.
But Jackson, so you're on today because, as we mentioned last week, when I asked you to come on the pod, you gave me ideas of like, hey, here's what I want to do. Carnival of Souls was one of them. Pink Flamingos was another one. And this was also another one too. And I knew I was going to get around to talking about this film, and I wanted to definitely talk about it. And because you brought it, I was like, well, of course I'm going to bring you on because fucking why not? But what I want to know, Jackson, is, this movie is definitely a cult film, but what is it about this movie made you want to come on here and talk about it? And what is it about this film that is intriguing to you or makes you want to analyze and talk about it with yours truly, myself?
Yeah, I love Reefer Madness. Reefer Madness, the movie.
Okay.
Yeah, Reefer Madness, the movie.
You are in Washington, so hey.
Yeah, we are I am in Seattle. So, oh my gosh, Reefer Madness, where did that come from? Well, on the Pink Flamingos podcast, I talked about that book, Midnight Movies by Jonathan Rosenbaum. And I remember Reefer Madness was in that book, but I didn't hear about it from that book. I heard about it from I heard about it from a book called The Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film, which was for the longest time before the internet became this hub for people to share files of obscure movies and stuff. There was this book, which was all a collection, a literal encyclopedia of like the weirdest, most obscure movies. And there was a great entry on Reefer Madness. And I was fascinated by these movies that had this sort of renaissance in the 70s and such. So Reefer Madness was one of them. It's a Wonderful Life and Wizard of Oz sort of had this recurring or this renaissance in the 60s and 70s with television. So in a sense, I was sort of obsessed with movies that got a second chance and found a new audience. And Reefer Madness just kept showing up, and I kept reading about how it was shown on college campuses, and college kids would get very, very stoned and watch it. And it was in the public domain. So I remember watching it and being like, this movie is terrible and garbage. And then I discovered it was a movie musical starring Alan Cumming. So I was a Broadway gay, and of course knew Alan Cumming, knew Kristen Bell, Anna Gasteyer, Saturday Night Live. So I sort of came to both movies at the same time, and it was just great to see. It was great to see how the musical improved on the original, but I still have a soft spot for the original.
Yeah, no, totally. Like you were saying on our Pink Flamingos episode, you I think it was either on the air or it was after we stopped recording, but you told me like, oh, hey, with Reefer Madness, like go listen to the riff track of it, which is on Tubi. And riff track is these like three friends, these guys who do like Mystery Science Theater type commentary to these bad movies.
Well, it's the Mystery Science Theater guys. So
it's them. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's Mike Nelson, Kevin, and yes. So it's the original three guys who are just doing riffing all over again.
I love that. Anyway,
Yeah.
but yeah, but I listened to them and it was fun. I watched the movie as well in preparation for this podcast. But yeah, I mean, as you said, it's not a good movie at all. And I think we can get into how the movie actually came to be and how there was, it's a propaganda film, it was the 30s, y'all, like it's a whole thing. But anyway, but yeah, and then the movie musical I was aware of because even though, yes, I was a Broadway gay, like I liked that kind of stuff. I am looking right over to my DVD collection and I see my copy of Rent that I got from a Blockbuster. A Blockbuster.
Speaking of bad movies, yeah.
The movie is
bad movies.
Rent, like when you are 13 is so fucking edgy.
Oh,
and it is just everything. And then when you even get a little bit older, you're just like, wow, you guys are whining about what? Like the fuck? Like, anyway, love you, Jonathan Larson. You seem like the cool guy. Larson.
Love you, Steven Chbosky, who directed it, who wrote Percy and Wallflower. But
yes, but I was gonna say Chris Columbus directed that. Excuse me.
Oh, Chris Columbus, that's right. But Steven Chbosky wrote it. He wrote the script.
I think he did. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I haven't seen Perks Being Wallflower, but I have read that book and I love that book.
Yes.
But yes, he did do that, but I don't stand Chris Columbus a ton. Whatever. But anyway, but like, yeah, I wasn't aware of it at the time, even though I probably could have seen it. Like, I was 13 at that time. But I came to it a little later because I listened to an episode of the Horror Queers who covered that movie because it's one of Trace's like favorite movies. Apparently he really likes it. And so he covered it on the podcast and that was cool. Also, This Ends at Prom did an episode on that as well with BJ Colangelo and her wife. Really great. So I mean, this is a movie that for people around our age, like people probably watched it when they were in middle and high school, really. And so yeah, and it was on Tubi and I was like, shit, I'm gonna turn this on and watch it. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I thought it was so fun and campy and lovely. And I'm sure we'll talk about how it improved, like you were talking about.
The original.
But as we normally do on the show, we're going to go through, both of these productions. We'll go through how these movies came to be and all that. But before we do that, though, as we normally do on this show, sometimes we give some history lessons here and there. And because I have Jackson here, who is unofficially a film historian to a point, I don't think that's what you do for your job or anything, but
I wish, but yeah,
I know, right? But you are somebody who has quite a vast knowledge of film and just film history and that kind of stuff. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just, how did Reefer Madness come to be? And to talk about that, I think it's important to give context about how exactly did exploitation movies come to be? Because for all intents and purposes, this film itself was turned into an exploitation movie. But I'm going to throw it over to you, Jackson. Give us a little bit of that sweet, sweet knowledge footage.
Yeah, well, exploitation movies, they had as we like to, I don't know, when we say exploitation movies, we mean movies that were made for a very low budget, very guerrilla filmmaking, like non-studio produced movies. So very different from B movies, because B movies were still technically a studio, even though they were a smaller studio. Exploitation was sort of like amateur filmmaking in the, no permits, people who don't have any acting skills or background, and just basically people who like raised their own money and made a movie and put it out. So everything was everything was grassroots. So it was from the funding to the acting to the writing and to the distribution. It was all kind of DIY. And there's a joke in film history, actually, in like film history textbooks, that's like exploitation is as old as movie making, because the first time somebody made a camera, the second thing that they filmed was like their girlfriend taking her clothes off. Like it was just like exploitation movies have always been there. But these movies are interesting because in the 30s, this is pre-depression. So, film was still very new and sound was very new. And there was a real fear with which is what there was a real fear that children specifically were going to be drawn to movies because they were big, bright things with sound, and they were, with something completely new. So parents really, really sort of advocated for a change in movies and like this sort of clause of decency, which is how we get the production code in 1934. So that basically wrote literally into a document like, you can't have this, this, and this. And so suddenly movies became a lot more cleaned up and nothing became as gritty. That's why you hear the phrase pre-code, because those movies had wonderfully scandalous things like, women being empowered, not by a man, and positive racial relations. Yeah.
Yes. I think of this a little bit to kind of butt in a little bit.
Yeah.
So with pre-code and stuff, this is where you get so you have when we think of this early type of filming a little bit, we think of when you think of children and you think of stuff that was marketed to them, you have cartoons, obviously. So those were important. So, Mickey Mouse, Steamboat Willie is what he was known as before, but you have these animation things going on. You have things like the Little Rascals, which were little shorts that were shot and made. Right. That kind of stuff. And Shirley Temple, I think, might have been around this time or maybe a little after, but that was a big deal to have a little girl, have as much power as she did in film,
right.
But I think what you were talking about as well with parents wanting to have a kind of handle on what was decent in the films and all that, I'm sure also comes from the fact that we have a little something called the Universal Monsters that came out at this time. And I'm sure that people who at this time were seeing things like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, and The Old Dark House, which are, I've at least seen Frankenstein, and I saw the Mexican version of Dracula, which is actually really good.
Yeah, it's a great Spanish version.
And also The Old Dark House. But all of these movies, not the Mexican Dracula one, but Frankenstein and what is it? Oh my gosh. The
Old Dark
House was made by a gay man who was literally out and everything. But yeah, I can only imagine that, especially with those kinds of movies, they're tame to what we think of now, I guess, when we think of horror, especially. But I'm sure parents were horrified of being like, what the fuck is this? So I thought I would just interject with that. But
no, it's a good point, and you're right. But their film was such a, it was so outside of the studios, anyone could do anything, and you're right. There was just it exploded onto the scene, just film period, that it was very hard to wrangle in. So yeah, there was this free for all of content and some pretty scandalous stuff. So the production code came along, and then there started to be movies that were made as a way of sort of coming back into American family moral values. And so there were these movies that were commissioned by the government that were pretty much propaganda and scare films. And Reefer Madness is one of them. There were also there was a syphilis movie called Sex Madness out there. And these actually, I mean, we'll get into it, but Reefer Madness is not the first of these movies. There were quite a number of them. There's a great one called Tomorrow's Children, or no, not Tomorrow's Children. Damaged Lives. Yeah. Tomorrow's Children is not good. Damaged Lives is great, but that was made by Edgar Ulmer, who made The Black Cat with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, a great pre-code horror. So Hollywood and the government were sort of in cahoots about these scare films about sex, adultery, drugs, and it was again sort of a doubling down of morality and values. Reefer Madness, like I said, by no means is the first or the last, and the exploitation movies sort of pick a different theme, and sort of there would be all these other movies that came about them. But the thing that distinguished these movies from studios is that these would literally be touring showmanship kind of events. So they were made not just to go into sort of the movie theaters to make money, but they were made to be taken into towns in middle America and the South, and especially to teach people about, these lessons of don't do drugs and don't have sex with strangers. And this continued into the 1950s. Probably the most famous exploitation movie is a 40s movie called Mom and Dad, which, tying in with Pink Flamingos, John Waters had said, like, when that came out, that was the only time that young boys could go and see a naked woman, because they show a literal birthing scene on screen in that. But that actually became the highest grossing movie of the 1940s, like ever, like period, because it was being traveled around by different people, showcasing it and sort of capitalizing on the scares of that movie, which was about, having sex out of wedlock and syphilis and such. But they always came with a little gimmick, and Mom and Dad actually had this thing where they had an actor similar to the guy at the beginning of Reefer Madness and who Alan Cumming plays in the movie musical. They actually had a lecturer who pretended to be a doctor and who would come out mid movie. There's a literal break in the movie where he would come out and give a lecture on syphilis and such. And so these movies capitalized on fear, and it's fascinating. Like, you think like, oh, of course this would never happen today, and it's like, well, it happens, but it's more subtle. There's for sure a lot of nationalist, pro-military subtext to movies like Transformers, Iron Man. There's a lot of post 9/11 fear of outsiders and something like Cloverfield or The Strangers. So I think this is, though, exploitation. I love it. I'm fascinated by it because it was just captured a moment in America where the people literally made money off of other people's fears.
Yeah, totally. I love that. Thank you so much for our history lesson. Is that pretty much the end of it, I guess? Like, unless you have more.
Yeah,
no, it's so true. Because when I think of exploitation, when it comes down to it, like, that is how kind of horror movies came to be.
Yeah.
Is that, yes, you had like the universal monsters, but then also having something like, but yeah, that's what also empowered like Val Lewton to make like his films with like Cat People, right? Le Diabolique, with that French filmmaker, like The Thing from Another World, Creature from the Black Lagoon, all that stuff. But so you can kind of put that into there. I also think like extreme, like, I don't know about like action, but like I'm trying to think what other kind of, so horror is definitely an exploitation. Anything that was kind of porno chic was definitely exploitation.
Yeah.
So we're talking like Debbie Does Dallas, The Devil and Mrs. Johnson, I believe, Deep Throat, all of these.
Those were, I mean, the thing about exploitation is you bring up a good point where it's like they almost break through the commercial because they get success either underground or through commercial distribution later. Pink Flamingos, great example. That is in a sense exploitation. It's DIY filmmaking that broke through to be known.
I think a huge one too. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to add, like, the porno chic, like Deep Throat for sure. I mean, although some people will argue that's not a movie, but
right, exactly.
But I think the thing about exploitation is the impact that it has on the culture. Herschel Gordon Lewis, all those, what's his name? Russ Meyer in the 60s. There were a lot of exploitation movies that came about, and it was in the 60s and 70s that it became a little more of shot in the dark. Like everyone could make a movie and have it released. And so it was hard to be like, well, this is exploitation, but that's not exploitation, unless it was something like blaxploitation, which really carved out its own niche on the market.
which is so fascinating to me because with blaxploitation, I am fascinated by those kinds of films. Check out Girl That's Scary. They did a blaxploitation episode where they talk about different movies. So these are films that could be in the horror genre, like, you know, you have like the Blackula movies, you have like Ganja and Hess to a point, I guess.
Yeah.
Other ones like that. But then you also have like, I just watched the Eddie Murphy movie, Dolomite is My Name.
Yeah.
And that movie is fucking great. It's so good. It's on Netflix. So please go watch it because you get to learn about Rudy Ray Moore and how he made this movie. Dolomite is on my list to watch on Tubi, so I will get around to it. I think that's so interesting. And blaxploitation is kind of the most popular one. Like when people think of exploitation, they think, oh, blaxploitation, The Harder They Come, things like that. So which is so fascinating to me because I was thinking of this while you were giving us your history lesson. I was thinking that like, yes, like you have all this going on in the 30s, but then you also have like horribly racist things going on too, which is so fascinating when you think of like blaxploitation. This is a response to the fact that, okay, we're past the civil rights movement a little bit and black folks are trying to get more of independence. And so they're making their own films to play in cinemas that are in more black neighborhoods, that are more specific to the community because, you know, they don't maybe want to watch the regular mainstream films because you can't always relate to that, especially when you are not a Caucasian, you know, heterosexual person, maybe, I don't know. But I think of this of like, when you think of a movie, like, for example, one of the first movies that ever had sound, The Jazz Singer, and literally that has everyone thinks like, oh yeah, it has the first bit of sound. It also has a horribly racist blackface depiction in there. And like, it's just so fascinating to me that I'm just like, wow, that is what our culture was in the 30s. You have this kind of a thing. And then you have something like Reefer Madness come out a couple years later, right? But then also like, yeah, well, you have that kind of a thing. Some of the cartoons that came out at that time, not even just to black folks, but like to Asian folks because of, you know, World War II and all that.
Right.
There's that.
There was a really, I mean, it was all about fundamental Christian ideas. And so that was code word for white. And, you know, and as, you know, there was definitely for sure some underlying, there was just this sort of need to preserve quote unquote American ways and values. And so there was a fear of the other, and that's prevalent too in the production code. I mean, you could argue that the production code, well, you can't argue it because it's true. It was written by a fundamentalist Christian pastor. And so it was in a sense kind of doubling down on this idea that Hollywood will always be conservative. But it's in exploitation movies, especially as we get into the 60s and 70s, with blaxploitation, with Russ Meyer, with Herschel Gordon Lewis, that we get the exploitation becoming social commentary. And the irony is that they were in that time, like decades after Reefer Madness and Mom and Dad and Sex Madness and stuff like that. Those filmmakers the filmmakers in the 60s and 70s were actually using exploitation to fight and say things about current social issues, whereas these movies were trying to make social issues out of something that didn't exist. So it was in a sense, this was actually used as propaganda, and then it was reversed almost. It had, you know, it was good intentions and good execution of what exploitation I think we all know it to be, which are these sort of, you know, DIY guerrilla style filmmaking that says something about society that mainstream doesn't say. So it's fascinating. It's interesting how these movies have evolved over the years.
Agreed. Yeah. And I can really, I agree with all of that. It's just like so fascinating to look at this. And then also thinking of like, you know, you could tie this also into like, just because I'm a horror head, like a lot of the time with like, even with horror movies, like, you know, a lot of the time you can see what fears are in the American consciousness by the horror movies that are there.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
In the 70s, in the 70s, you have like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you
Mhm.
have like Halloween and like all these different ones. And it's very much this, but the 70s were also crazy. Like the gas shortage that happened
Mhm.
that is depicted in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that
Yeah.
was a real thing. Like there were just some gas stations that didn't have gas, and they were just
Mhm.
like, we don't have anything, and it could just feel like there was a lot of cosmic shit going on where you're like, the world's gonna end. Like this is
Yeah.
ridiculous and crazy. Like Richard Nixon's in the White House lying to everybody. Like, it's just like a whole thing, y'all. Like this is
Mhm.
ridiculous. So you have that, and I think that is reflected in the horror of the 70s, where it feels gritty. It feels this kind of like whatever you want to call it, which is why you have these movies. Then in the 80s, you have Reaganomics, and you have Reagan in the White House. And that was just also real pretty on the surface a lot of the time. But
Mhm.
underlying, you have the horrid, like, war on drugs that didn't do fucking anything. And then you have the AIDS crisis where queer people are dying and people of color are dying, and nobody seems to give a shit. And so it's just like these movies that came out, I think also some of them could be a reflection of just what was going on at that time, really. And then,
Yeah.
and then also with 2000s, post 9/11, I mean, this has been like analyzed to death, but like, the fact that we had all of these quote torture porn movies,
Mhm. Yeah.
when we are also seeing a war from our television sets. And
Yeah.
you and me are old enough to know that, yes, we would just see like, footage of people in Iraq, just on the news, just like there. Like, okay, cool. We weren't seeing, I
Yeah.
guess, the dead
The
bodies, but we
news,
were seeing that. And it's like,
but
wow.
the news describing, waterboarding, and the news describing what the detainees in Guantanamo Bay were going through, or how we were going to get information out. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And so,
Yeah.
it always manifests. Yeah, I agree with you. It always manifests in horror,
Mhm.
whether it's obvious or not. I
Right.
mentioned earlier there were a lot of, there were movies like Cloverfield and
Yeah.
these movies that were about attacks on America.
Yeah.
But then also you got movies like The Strangers and
Mm-hmm.
Michael Haneke's Funny Games remake with
Yeah.
Naomi Watts, and that were about domestic terrorism. And so this threat of your neighbor or just people randomly in the middle, like that America has gone bad, so to speak. And it's fascinating. I'm really interested. I haven't talked with any of my horror movie history friends about like what the 2010s are about, because again we were sort of living through all those movies. But I think you can absolutely draw parallels between movies of each decade and what was going on in America. And Reefer Madness, going back to that, I think is more directly a propaganda film, not only because it was literally commissioned and made by the government, but because the intention of everything in it is to further an idea, which is stated in the first 5 minutes or so, which is weed is bad, and if you or your kids smoke it, you'll murder and assault people.
Yeah, and you'll just hit people with your cars and everything. It's fine.
Yeah, which is just insane. So
it's crazy.
yeah.
But yeah, so we had our fun history lesson about exploitation films, and God, we could go on about that for a long time.
Well, let me just say, for listeners who are interested in learning more, there's a great book by Eric Schaffer, which is called Bold, Daring, Shocking, True, which is about the history of the golden age of exploitation. And then there's a great documentary called American Grindhouse, which is, I think, available for free on Tubi with commercials. But that also sort of shows exploitation. But Eric Schaffer's book is probably the definitive book on it. Yeah,
totally. But yeah, so we'll get into, I guess, what we're going to talk about in the episode itself, talk about Reefer Madness and the movie musical. So we'll start with the original movie. So again, we'll go over this and then we'll move into how this movie has a legacy of some sort, and then how it became a musical exactly. So with our normal figures we do, so we have Reefer Madness. It was released in 1936. I don't have a date for it. It was the original release, and then it was reissued in 1938 and 1939. This was directed by Louis J. Gosner, written by Arthur Horrell, and then produced by George Herleman and Dwayne Esper. And we're looking at a budget of about $100,000, which I don't know what the today's would be, but I'm sure it's more than 100,000 in today's money. A box office, I don't have box office money from that time because I don't even know if they kept records like that, but I do have that it made about $1.4 million with a new 1970s reissue that they did. So this movie did make some money, probably on the midnight movie circuit at that time. We're looking at a 39% on Tomato Meter and a 37% on the audience score. Not a 90. No, girl, we are not going to have that.
No, not at all. Not at all.
3.7 out of 10 on IMDb and a 2.1 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So that is our figures we have. And then we have our, I know, right? And then we have our cast of characters from 1936. So we have Dorothy Short as Mary Lane, Kenneth Craig as Bill Harper, Lillian Miles as Blanche, Dave O'Brien as Ralph Wiley, Thelma White as May Coleman, and Carlton Young as Jack Perry, who I think those are like the kind of big main characters we have that I believe are also in the movie musical, if I'm not mistaken. And you got some other random people. So like you have like the doctor, who is that? Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think it's like Dr. Alfred Carroll, who I guess is the guy in the beginning of the movie, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's him.
That's him. You know, and some uncredited people too, whatever. But yeah, as I stated before, those like 6 people that I just talked about, those are like our main characters we have that are in this little movie. Some critical response quotes of this movie. I have about 3 of them. We have the Film Force staff who states, perhaps the mother of all bad movies. However, the didactic film, unlike later stinkers, takes itself extremely seriously, seeing itself as an important instrument in the campaign against drugs. However, the film's ignorance is the audience's bliss. And then we have Sarah Boslaw from the Arts STL, who states, before it became an ironic cult hit in the 1970s, Reefer Madness was a well-intentioned and unintentionally hilarious cautionary tale entitled Tell Your Children, which is just her telling us what the movie is. And then Maddie Lucas from The Front Row, who states, strictly an amateur hour production filled with laughably over-the-top acting and a silly sense of self-righteousness that makes it the perfect exploitation camp classic. Now, there we go, Maddie Lucas. There we go.
Someone gets it. Thank God.
There you go. All right, cool. Yeah. So the information I have, and feel free to, you know, butt in with whatever you need. But what I found was that in 1936 or 38, Tell Your Children was financed, and it was made by a church group. It was intended to show be shown to parents as a morality tale, attempting to teach them about the dangers of cannabis abuse. It was originally produced by, like I said, George Herleman. However, after some time after the film was done, it was actually purchased by Dwayne Esper, who is an exploitation filmmaker, who inserted some salacious shots. And in 1938 or 9, Esper himself started releasing this on the exploitation circuit, where it was originally released at least in 4 territories, each with their own title. So in the South, it was seen as Tell Your Children. In west of Denver, Colorado, it was known as Dope to Youth. In New England, it was known as Reefer Madness, which is what it's known as by everybody now. And then in the Pennsylvania, West Virginia area, in my area, kind of, I guess, it would be called The Burning Question. That also sounds like a STI thing, but okay, whatever. But then the film was also screened all around the country, like you were saying, during the 40s, under these various titles. And Albert Dizel of Detroit eventually bought all the rights in 1951 to use it for roadshow screenings throughout the 1950s. So that's like the big thing. And then you were talking about like such educational exploitation films became a thing under the production code. So Marijuana from 1936 was one. And then also Elmer Clifton's Assassin of Youth, which I don't know if you know about that one, but that's one as well.
I've seen it. Yeah.
Yes, and then the subject
Well,
of
and
cannabis.
marijuana, I think, was directed by Esper.
I think it was too. That's what it seems to say. Yeah. And then the subject of cannabis was particularly popular in the hysteria surrounding Anslinger's 1937's Marijuana Tax Act, which was a year after Reefer Madness had come out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Anything to add to that of how the movie kind of got made and got to
No, Esper. Well, except that Esper's an important name to know with exploitation. I think he was part of the group, the 40 Thieves or something like that, and it was Dwayne Esper and Kroger Babb and oh my gosh, David Friedman, like all these sort of on the fly exploitation filmmakers who made these movies, and then also were sort of the carnival barker of them in society. So they would take them from town to town and go around. But Esper was, I don't want to say the most successful of all of them, but he made the most. I mean, he did make Sex Madness, he made Marijuana, he made a movie called Maniac in 1934, a movie called Narcotic, I think the year before or the year after, one of the two. But so he was really kind of a capitalizing on the sensationalism of these movies and just sort of kept churning these types of movies out for audiences. Yeah. He also, if I remember correctly, I don't know why this is standing out, and listeners write in if I'm wrong, but I think he re-released Freaks out into the world. If I'm not mistaken, I think he's responsible for re-releasing it.
Yeah, so the preservation and copyright status of this film. So the concept of aftermarket films in film distribution had not been developed yet. So they didn't have copyright, I guess, back then, or something. Anyway, especially for films that existed outside the confines of the studio system, as we talked about earlier, and also in our last episode about Pink Flamingos, talking about the studio system and how it died, and was therefore considered forbidden fruit. So for this reason, neither Esper nor Herleman bothered to protect the copyright, which is probably why it fell into the public domain. So that it then had an improper copyright notice invalidating it. So for over 30 years later, in the spring of 1972, some guy by the name of Keith Strupp, he found a copy of this film in the Library of Congress. He bought it for $297, and as part of a fundraising campaign, this thing he founded, which was NORML, normal, he showed it around up and down colleges in California, asking for donations of $1, and raised $16,000, which is the equivalent of about $112,000 in today's money. Wow. Towards support for the California Marijuana Initiative, which sought to legalize marijuana in the 1972 fall elections over in California. And then Bob Shea, our girl Bob Shea, Bob Shea,
Line Cinema, Bob Shea,
eventually heard about this underground hit and went to see it at the Bleecker Street Cinema. He noticed the film carried the improper copyright notice and realized it was in the public domain. Seeking materials for New Line's college circuit, he was able to obtain an original copy from the collector, and he began also distributing this nationally, quote, making a small fortune for New Line, which then also helped with him doing all of his other shit he was doing, like making, helping to distribute Pink Flamingos and all that. And then in 2004, Legend Films restored and colorized the print of the movie, featuring unintentionally unrealistic color schemes that add to this campy humor. So the smoke from marijuana was made to appear green, blue, orange, and purple, and each person's colored smoke representing their mood and their level of addiction. And so some people didn't like that apparently, but oh well, it's fine. But yeah, and then this movie is considered, as my show states, a cult classic, and is one of the most popular examples of a midnight movie. Its fans enjoy the film for the same unintentionally campy production values that made it a hit in the 70s. And then we already went over the Rotten Tomatoes score and everything like that. And again, so like the Los Angeles Times claimed that Reefer Madness was the first film that a generation embraced as its worst. And Leonard Maltin, who's a very known film critic, has stated that it's the granddaddy of all worst films. And Las Vegas City Life has named it the worst ever runner-up to Plan 9 from Outer Space, which don't worry, it's on the list to do. But yeah, so that's a little bit about that. And yeah, I mean, if you had to, so Jackson, to kind of give a baseline of what our plot is, if you had to describe Reefer Madness to somebody who's never seen it before, how would you describe this movie and how would you say what happens in it?
Tell your children that smoking marijuana is bad. It's where do I start? I mean, the framing of the movie starts with this doctor, educator,
some guy from the street. I don't know.
Some guy from the street who is preaching to a parents' association at a school about the dangers of marijuana and begins to take us on this, forces us on this trip to hear about a young boy named Jimmy Harper and how he was just a fine, nice, wonderful, all-American family boy who got so caught up in the wrong crowd that he began to smoke marijuana. And it kind of goes into the den of the opium den, of the cast of characters that are in there who are just these degenerates who just have sex and dance to swing time and smoke reefer and
exactly.
And it's just wild how much the movie spends on these this alternative lifestyle that these reefer smokers have, that it actually turns into being like, that actually looks fun.
It looks like a good time.
It looks like a great time. But it basically is about Jimmy Harper, who becomes addicted to marijuana, and as a result, he turns into a murderous person and destroys his life with it, and takes everyone down with him, including the girl of his dreams. It's just a wild. It's hysterical to watch because the movie thinks that it is making this big deal. Yeah, but it's actually so comically bad. Like, it misses. Like the fact that you watch it, and again you say, the government made this. It was like, who would believe this? It is so outlandish. So that's kind of a brief snapshot of it. Yeah,
sure. I'll take it. It seems fine. Yeah. I mean, like, basically, you have May and Jack are an unmarried couple, I guess, and they are living together and they sell marijuana. And then, Jimmy and Mary Lane, who is his
his best girl. Yeah.
Best girl, right? And it's them just
which we find them. What's great is we find the movie musical does a fantastic job with this, but we find them first in reading Romeo and Juliet. And thinking like, oh, it's gonna have a happy ending. And they're so dumb.
Stupid. They're so stupid. God, yeah. And then just like the whole idea of like, it's these things of like, because it gets all to that. So like, spoiler, I guess, obviously you came for this, but like, like Jimmy runs over a guy and nobody knows about it except for him and the guy who's in the car with him. And then like, somehow Mary Lane gets shot, and then the drug people like make Jimmy think like he thought he did it or something. May, who's like the lady or whatever, like she jumps out the window to her death after she's being like questioned or whatever the hell. Makes no sense. And then of course, like, this movie just ends with like, the next tragedy may be like your daughter or your son or yours, and like literally the guy playing the doctor is just like looking right at the camera, and that's the
literally looks dead straight down the barrel of the camera and says, or yours.
It's so good
as it fades to the credits. Yeah,
just so dumb. Like, and then like even things of like, so I'm looking at some of the fun little notes. So like, and of course they use these as like, oh, these are like real things. So like, apparently it was inspired by the case. This is also coming from IMDb, so like take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But like apparently like this movie was also inspired by like the case of Victor Licata, who killed his father, mother, two brothers, and a sister with an axe in Tampa, Florida, in 1933, allegedly while under the influence of marijuana. He was declared unfit to stand trial for reasons of insanity. Subsequent psychiatric examination at the Florida State Mental Hospital determined that he was schizophrenic with homicidal tendencies, and so this was used to propagate the passage of the Federal Marijuana Act, Tax Act in 1937, which outlawed the legal sales of the demon weed. But again, that sounds like a guy who was already like a schizophrenic, and he in the 30s was not medicated, and so he ended up killing people.
Right.
But not because it was weed, it was because we didn't understand mental health and mental illness in the 30s. Like,
well, and also I was like, was that weed laced with something too? Because
exactly,
that's kind of, whoo, yeah. I know.
Right.
What's great in this is if you do partake of, then you know that it slows you down, and there are full scenes in this where they there's that great an iconic scene, shall we say, that is now canon of them they're at the Reefer Den, and a woman is playing a piano, and this guy is high on his mind, just going like faster, faster, and she's smoking weed, and the weed supposedly is making the piece go faster, but it's just like none of this is true.
Yeah, it's just like so crazy, and it's like I think that is what lends this movie to be so ripe for mockery, and for it's this unintentional camp to it. You know, we can get into all about camp and shit like that too, but like, you know, just the idea of like, I think this movie obviously was made by the government as like a stone serious, like, you know, anti-drug thing, right? But I think now looking back on it, and especially into like the 70s, probably when it was being shown ironically, it's because like this is so over the top that, I mean, how could it not be considered camp in a way? Because it's divulging into what camp is, which is this kind of abandon of taste, or an abandon of like, you know, things that are kind of just like, what's the word? Artificial, like there's kind of celebrated, because it's so villainous, it's so cartoonishly villainous is what it is, and that's just what I think is so fascinating about this movie. It's not good at all, it should be made fun of all the time, and you should not watch this stone cold fucking movie of this. Like, please watch it with something. Otherwise it's just boring. Like, you're just like, what is this?
It's a boring ass film if you watch it stone cold sober. That's a great point. You
can't like
No, it is, and yes, have some kind of stimulant of some kind, and even riff tracks, you know, is a great stimulant because they make fun of it as it goes on.
Something.
If you just watch it straight, and I've watched it straight before, and it's only a 68-minute movie, something crazy like that. It feels like 4 fucking hours. It feels like 4 long goddamn hours, because again, these were people who had never made a movie before, and so there's just long continuity issues, and the acting is bad, the dialogue is so stilted. It's amazing how it got made but again, by the government. So
and I guess you could watch it as like a thing of like, hey, you want to see America make propaganda films? Here you go, or whatever. Because it's not, I mean, I haven't watched like the Nazi propaganda films. Like, I don't want to, but you know, but like also it's like, I mean, we were kind of doing that with this because we were trying to demonize weed, and it makes no sense why you would. Okay, it makes sense of why they did it at the time, because again, older people were just scared of things in the 30s, and they were afraid of. We can also talk about just very briefly, but like the fact that in the 50s, teenagers became a thing. Like, you have like movies like Rebel Without a Cause, or like the Maybe Van Doren, films that she was in, or any of
Yep.
these things with like, these are kind of like these teenage delinquent, juvenile delinquent type movies, because pre that, teenagers weren't seen as like a thing, really. Like they were obviously a thing, because obviously you have to grow up and be a teenager, but like, it's just that, it's just seen as like this, you're thinking like, okay, children, everything that's not an adult, and then children, I guess, and then older people, the elderly people, I guess. But like, teenagers kind of got their own little thing, when they have these juvenile delinquent movies come out, and you're showing this kind of rebellious side, especially during a time that in the 50s was so kind of cookie cutter and everything. We're not going to go too deep into it because it's not about this movie, but mental hygiene films that you can get to and talk about all that. We don't have to mention, if you want to give a brief introduction of what that would be, it ties a little bit into the kind of films that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, mental hygiene films are an interesting kind of part of that. Go listen to This Ends at Prom and their episode on Pleasantville, because they talk about that as well. And Pleasantville is actually a great example of that.
It is a great example. Yeah,
it is. But Jackson, do you want to give, like, before we move into the movie musical and talk a little bit about how that came to be, just talk a little bit about what the mental hygiene film is? Because it does kind of tie a little bit into this kind of filmmaking with like scare filmmaking. It's in the same neighborhood as that.
Yeah, it's funny. Mental hygiene. Where do we start with this?
I think the best way to explain it, I guess, if we wanted to, just to kind of basic it on it, would be that a mental hygiene film is kind of like a film where they wheel the projector into class one day during health class, or during your, like, I don't know, home economics class or something, who knows. And they show this film that is made as like, this is how life should be. And this is how you should be a standing citizen.
Right. These were the posture pals. These were the don't cheat on the exam. Yeah. These were instructional films that were made. You're right. Specifically for classroom. Okay. Yes. Okay. Now it's all coming back to me.
Kind of thing. Yeah.
So, and Dwayne Esper, actually, back to Dwayne Esper, he made oh my God, it's a shocking move. It's a shocking one, but it was made specifically. It has a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek tone to it. But it's he made one for women called "How to Undress in Front of Your Husband." So yeah, they were basically these doubling down on morality, but how to be like a good American citizen and all American person. And in a sense, it was like devoid of anything that could be sexual or political or substance related of any kind, but it was to create, good, upstanding American citizens. And you're right. It's from that we get scare films in especially the 50s, as you mentioned, of juvenile delinquency and such, which kind of emerged out of these scare films of the 30s because they were aimed at teenagers and stuff like that. And they said, well, what's worse than drugs and unprotected sex? It was like, well, rebellious teens against the system and such. So I think also there was an undercurrent, thinking about not just film history, but history period. There was kind of an undercurrent of it around World War II and after World War II. There was sort of a nationalist, it sort of came from the isolationist perspective that we had of, we didn't want any other thoughts that were not American. And so if a teenager wanted to say fuck the system, then they were a communist or a threat to American society. And so yeah, these mental hygiene movies were just about keeping up with appearances and being the best brother, son.
Right. This is how you do your makeup for, a lady. This is how you groom yourself as a young man.
Yeah.
Here's how you go into a job after high school and how you don't be like a dick. And like, But then you also have like the weird ones of like, you see this guy, he is a homosexual and he preys on young men.
Yeah.
Those are real.
There's one, if you just if you listeners, if you go to YouTube and type in "Boys Beware," there's a great educational short film, which I thought was fake for the longest time, by the way. But no, it's very much real about homosexuals. It's quite shocking.
Jesus
but again,
crazy.
a different time. It's not defending them, but it was a different time. It was a different time.
It is. And also when you think about it, like, so like America after the war of World War II, we actually had it all right because like we didn't get decimated like fucking Germany did. Okay. So like we didn't have to build our shit back up from the ground up because we got bombed.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
So yes, we got bombed at Pearl Harbor, but like that's a little different because anyway. So then you have all of these, and then what's crazy too when you think about it. So like not to you get into a tangent, but like you know what you came for, but like you have women entering the workforce at this time when the men were all away, actually experiencing a level of independence and being able to work and shit like that. And then also probably being able to discover maybe the little bit of like a little bit of Lady Lake, if you will. Realizing that maybe they didn't love their husbands as much as they like. And then men come back and it all goes back to, normal. But when you think about it, this is exactly why in something like the 50s of a decade, it was all about appearances. It's all about like everything has to be the same and look the same and all of this, because you have these people who came back from a war who we did not understand mental health. We did not understand post-traumatic stress disorder. That is exactly why you had people who were turning to alcohol and who were beating their wives and all of this because they didn't know how to handle the horrible shit that they probably saw when they were at war. Okay. So it's like it all ties back. Like it's just like that is exactly what the 50s was the way it was, because it's all about keeping up appearances. Mental hygiene films are really a big part of the 50s, especially as in Pleasantville, it's kind of talking about that. It's kind of like very much that, but like it is very much like this. Everything on the surface is like supposed to be the same and it's supposed to be this, but under the undercurrent, you have this like, you have like these teenage delinquents, these juvenile delinquents. You have the start of rock and roll, which was started by black people and then accosted by white people. And all of this stuff, you got all this, brewing underneath, divorce, people realizing that they hated their husbands, whatever. And then in the 60s, you had a little bit of that. And then it kind of blew up because then people were like, fuck this. And then it kind of comes all out, but it was just, it's insidious for the 50s in a weird way.
Right.
Because it's not outward. In the 60s, I think it became more outward.
It built to a cathartic explosion. And I think too, in the 50s, there was still this need to, there was the sort of generational cultural thing of just, keeping it all inside.
Yes.
But also it was still a cause and effect from a foreign distanced thing. And it wasn't until basically like JFK got assassinated that like the fabric of America began to be like, oh shit, it's one of us could kill the president. One of us could, do this, or at least it didn't ground into American, the American social fabric as much until then. Yeah. Totally. But I also say with these films, I don't think they actually helped the cause. Like Reefer Madness, Mom and Dad, like I actually think they made it worse. And they're propaganda. Propaganda can be good, but I think most all propaganda sort of perpetuates the negative, not the positive. And so, that there was so much output for these of these movies, I don't think it actually helped America or Americans. I think it made them more scared. I think it made them more scared of each other, of And that probably was the purpose, because these places, the government wanted to be the sole ones in control of futures and stuff like that. So
Totally.
yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
Anyway, so we're going to get off of our history lesson because this is but there is a lot to this, because there is a lot to unpack with Reefer Madness, because these were your tax dollars at work.
Yes,
so
exactly.
It's like, there's a lot to that. And so being able to talk about that kind of stuff is good. But we're going to get into a way more fun, thing, which is the movie musical from 2005 of this movie. This is directed by Andy Finkman, who also, I believe, directed the actual stage musical. It was written by Kevin Murphy and Dan Studney, and it was produced by also Andy Finkman. All these guys, they pretty much produced
Kevin Murphy, by the way, I think Riff Tracks and Mystery Science Theater, if that's the same Kevin Murphy.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah,
probably.
Yeah.
We're looking at a $25 million budget, which for a TV movie is kind of big. We could talk about Cherry Falls at some point, because I want to do an episode on that too, but that was 15 million and it turned into a TV movie.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's no box office information because this is a TV movie on Showtime. But we're looking at a 75% on the tomato meter on Rotten Tomatoes and an 87% audience score, and then a 7.1 out of 10 on IMDb and a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So that's our figures for the movie musical. And then we got our cast of characters. So I'll talk about just the main principal cast. We have Alan Cumming as many different people. He's the lecturer in the beginning, but he's also the goat man in one of the dance sequences. He's FDR, and he's other minor characters. Christian Campbell, the brother of Nev Campbell, is Jimmy Harper. Kristen Bell, right around the same time as Veronica Mars, is Mary Lane. And Steven Weber is Jack Stone and George Washington in the Tell 'Em the Truth song. Anna Gasteyer, off the heels of being on SNL. This is after she was in Mean Girls, all this. She is May Coleman. John Kassir, my hometown boy from Baltimore, and also the Crypt Keeper himself. He plays Ralph Wiley, and he's also Uncle Sam in Tell Them the Truth. Mm-hmm. And then Amy Spanger, the former wife of Michael C. Hall, Dexter himself and David Fisher himself, is Sally DeBonis, who I don't think is in the original movie at all.
I don't think so. No.
Robert Torti as Jesus in one of the dance numbers. And then Nev Campbell plays the Miss Poppy, who I don't think had an actual character in the original movie. It was a guy.
The original. Yeah.
Yeah,
it was great to see her pop up on screen. I
loved it.
I completely forgot that she has a great cameo in it, and I was like, "Oh
she does.
God,
it's great. It's wonderful, and she's only in there for like 5 minutes. It's fun.
Oh yeah, it's great.
But you also have like Christine Lakin. She's Joan of Arc. Is fun. Ken Kersinger, the Freddy versus Jason. He's like a Secret Service agent. And then also Michael Gorgian, who, if you've seen SLC Punk, he is Heroin Bob. He was on Party of Five and stuff like that. He's also in this little. He is in the lecture. He's in the assembly that they're all in. So
in the beginning, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I didn't find really many. There was only 8 quotes from critics. The one bad one I had was from Scott Weinberg from Film Critic, who said maybe a few bong hits would make this thing funnier. Okay, but then of course I gotta give my props to Trace Thurman from the Horror Queers podcast, who states, without a doubt, one of the funniest and wittiest movie musical parodies ever made, which I will give him that. Anyway, so do you have anything to add about the movie musical before I go into any production history or anything like that?
Not the making of it. No, I just remember that this, and maybe you'll get to this in the production history, that it was, and I don't even think it was off Broadway, but it originated in LA. I think the musical had its premiere in LA.
It did,
and was fairly successful. And I think Campbell was in it, not Nev Campbell.
Yes,
yeah, I think he was the original Jimmy.
He originated it, yeah.
Yeah, and so I love a parody musical. We take them for granted nowadays, because there's so many. There's the Titanic, which is now off Broadway, and there was a Seinfeld musical parody out now. There's Stranger Sings, the Stranger Things parody. So, but this was an early adopter of a parody musical. So I really like this. But it doesn't just parody the movie. It kind of opens up the movie in a new way, and it sort of leans into the absurdity of it. By making it, there's the orgy scene. There's a scene
the zombies.
The zombies. There's a scene where Jesus sings. There's I don't remember brownies being in the original, but there's a whole scene about brownies, and so
there isn't.
It's great.
Yeah, no, and also fun little fact about the DVD of the movie is that it actually came in a brownie scented like case or something. So that's kind of fun. I think also because at this point people were aware that you could make pot brownies, so that's probably why that was in there, which I think is really a fun thing to kind of put a twist on. But yeah, so in 1998, we have writing partners Kevin Murphy and Dan Studney, who had met while studying at Drew University in New Jersey. They were driving from Oakland to Los Angeles. So maybe it's not the same Kevin Murphy. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe it is. You could do the research and development if you want. But anyway, they were driving from Oakland to Los Angeles, and they began listening to Frank Zappa's Joe's Garage when they began discussing how one might stage this piece. So he was picturing in his head, Studney recalls Frank Zappa's concept of a musical, and then it hit him. He turned to Kevin and he said, "What about doing Reefer Madness as a musical?" By that time, the duo had reached LA. They had already written the first song. And so upon completion of the script that they wrote, they approached Andy Finkman, who had won awards for being a director, and he accepted the project with great enthusiasm. He said, "I was a big fan of the original movie. It always made me laugh. Then I listened to Dan and Kevin warbling away on the demo track, which didn't make me laugh. It made me cry. But the music was good. And I thought, God, if real singers were singing this." And then when I read the script, I fell in love with it. So he was like enamored with it.
Yeah.
And so the play opened in a small equity theater, a waiver theater in LA. What the producers thought would be a 2-week run. It played to pack houses for over a year and a half, captivating audiences and critics alike. And it won 20 theater awards and broke records. And many people came back to see it dressed in costumes and shouting at the lines. Do we see a connection here? And so kind of worked out that way. There were a couple additions to the show. Major changes were made near the end of the LA run. So Lonely P was added to the first act. There were a couple different things like this coming in. Oh, apparently the orgy scene was revamped with new choreography by Paula Abdul. So there were like little changes here and there. But yeah, they moved that to off-Broadway, and then Murphy and Studney made some changes to the text as well. So yeah, we're looking at Christian Campbell. He originated Jimmy Harper, and Robert Torti, who had also been on Broadway. He was also Jack Stone, and he was Jesus in the original movie, the original stage show. And John Cassier also originated the Ralph role as well. So they all came to the movie. Nobody else did, though, I don't think. But then we have those same people, but then also when they went to New York, that is when they added Kristen Bell, and she did originate that. She didn't originate the role of Mary, but she was like the second person. She was doing it in New York, and then she came to the movie because she just accidentally got a show, and that's why she got it, probably. Because when you get like, I don't know, when you get because Kristen Bell was like an unknown at that time, and by that point, oops, like you have a whole show that people like on UPN. Okay, we're gonna put you in this movie now. Do you want to do this since you're already doing it? But yeah, so anyway, but that's pretty much how it came to be. I mean, really, that's what I found, at least, is it seems like this musical took on a life of its own, and it really mimicked the normal of a midnight movie, which makes apt sense because this was a midnight movie at one point. So, but yeah, I just think like, I think if anything, so like, I'm not going to go over the plot again because literally the plot is pretty much this movie. Are there any blaring differences? I know there are, but are there any blaring differences from the original text to the movie that we want to kind of highlight a little bit, except for just the zombies and the orgy?
Well, I think the biggest is that they mainly go into depth about they really make it a point to make fun of how what the weed is doing to Jimmy.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So, they kind of focus a lot on his moral, the good boy turned bad kind of storyline, which I think the original movie does not go too in depth into. It's almost like he smokes weed and then becomes a bad person. And in here, in the musical, because I guess they have more time, they really sort of go into him sort of wrestling that. But then also, once he becomes the bad kid, like how just really bad he is, but outlandishly, so it's comical how big he gets, in terms of just how it's just absurd. They have more opportunities to focus on different characters, and so some characters who don't even have a name in the original suddenly are, side characters or sidekicks and stuff like that. So it really opens up the story in a new way. And it's great. It just feels like a fun playground ride. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoy the addition of Sally because I think Amy Spanger did such a good job, but also the fact that they added that she's a mother and that she has a baby.
Right, with a baby, yeah.
And they set the baby's bassinet on fire, but the baby's okay. Like, it's a whole thing because she's high and she's like. I also love that they make her so clumsy. Oh my god, that shit rocked my world. It was so funny.
She just keeps running into stuff. Yeah,
running into stuff. She's falling down the stairs. It's so funny. And then she gets her head cut off. It's a whole thing. But anyway, there's that. I mean, for sure. And then also, like you were saying, I mean, just like some of the irreverent comedy that's in it too. Just like which again was of the time, I guess. And I honestly, what I will say though, I don't think there's anything too horrible in this. It was 2005, everybody. I mean,
no, and it's a made-for-TV movie, so within reason, they still had to. They still had to do stuff.
The sauciest they got was that what is this? How do you say this? I don't speak Mexican. Like, okay. Like, that's about as saucy as they could get. So
yeah. I think it's a really great musical adaptation because, and what's great about Kevin Murphy, I just did a quick search. No, it is not the Mystery Science Theater Kevin Murphy. I wish it was. But the Kevin Murphy who did write it did do the Heathers musical.
Love that.
Great, which is also a great adaptation of the movie to the Broadway stage. But he just, it's a good movie musical because it's just fun. And I think that's where, the original movie is not fun. It's boring.
No, not at all.
As we said, it's turgid in parts, where it's just like, oh my God, like most of it is a slog. So the fact that they combined, the absurdity of the original with honestly kind of movies from the 50s, where it was open it up. There's just more supporting cast. And I think it works very well. And it's a musical comedy. So it's irreverent, it's raunchy. It's joke after joke after joke. There's very little self-awareness. Yeah, it's great.
The characters are stupid. Like, oh my god, Mary Lane and Jimmy are stupid.
They don't have any, semblance of logic ever.
No, which is making fun of the idea of like, I think it's making fun of just like in the 30s with like people on film. It's like, did nobody have a brain at this time? Like, what is going on?
Yeah,
like, huh? I don't know. It's crazy.
It's great.
Do you have a particular favorite song from this musical?
Oh, two. I love "Listen to Jesus, Jimmy." I think that's it just comes out of nowhere and it's hysterical. But I love Mary Jane.
Oh, I love it too.
Phenomenal. And I remember like just when I watched it for the first time and like everyone in the movie is singing it.
I love that too. I was gonna bring that up. I was like, oh my god, like Nev Campbell's like driving the car.
It's so fucking funny. And the hobo sings it, the dead hobo gets up and sings it. Anna Gasteyer and Steven Weber are singing it. It's so good. It's so funny. I love that one. And Romeo and Juliet made me laugh out loud.
It's
the first time I saw it because not just the staging, but like the lyrics were just
so good.
Brilliant.
I must say I love Mary Jane, Mary Lane because it's ridiculous. I do love Romeo and Juliet. That's a good one too. I even like the stuff from Anna Gasteyer.
Yeah.
Because also shout out to Justin Nordell. He's on Letterboxd. He's like a movie guy or whatever, movie gay. He's in Philadelphia, I think. Anyway, I follow him on Letterboxd, and he says like every time Anna Gasteyer just screams rapes me outside of the window, which again, horrid, but like it never fails to make him choke on his drink.
Oh, it's great. It's great.
It's so stupid and funny. Like it is ridiculous.
Great choice.
It's so good. And even Murder. I like Murder because like that's literally the zombie song. So like it is because when the zombies come up, man, I'm literally like, what the fuck is this movie? But I am all in.
Yeah.
Like, I am all in. But yeah, so oh god. Anyway, but yeah, so yeah, I think that's really all I can think. And then I think that's a nice little amalgamation of both of these films and everything. I'm trying to think how to wrap this up, if anything. Don't watch the first movie. It's not great. If you're gonna watch it with a commentary or something because it's boring. And absolutely go watch this movie musical because it's so fucking funny and so fun.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really good.
I might even go, who knows? I might even go buy that brownie scented Blu-ray or DVD or whatever. I might just do that. I probably should add it to there. I might as well, right?
It's great. Yeah, it's great. I think it's streaming. It's streaming on Tubi.
It is. And Vudu and all that.
And Vudu. And the original is in the public domain, but you can find both Riff Tracks versions. There's a Riff Tracks 3 Riffer version and of the colorized version, and then also the Riff Tracks Live, which you can find also on Tubi. Both of those. Yeah.
Yes. And also it's on Showtime for some reason. I don't know why, but it is, if you want to go watch it there. If you have a Showtime subscription, if you're going to watch Yellow Jackets like I do. Yes. Anyway, but I think that's a good little wrap up to this episode. I'm so happy to have had this conversation with you, Jackson.
So great. Thank you.
Because I think we got to go on a fun tangent about just like film history, but it kind of makes sense though with what we're talking about. And I'm so happy to have you back and everything. But please tell the people where they can find you on social media if you want them to, stalk you or whatever. Yeah,
stalk me. Instagram at jackson.cooper.arts, website jcooperarts.com. Yeah, so those, you can just find me on those. I don't update my Letterboxd as much as I should, but
I'll make you.
I'm on Letterboxd at Let's Movie. And that's where you can find me. Thanks for having me again 2 times in a row.
I know, right? Trying to get the people, what they want. not that I've had requests for you, but I like you, so that's why I want to have you on. But thank you so much, and have a great rest of your evening.
Yeah,
okay?
Thanks.
As always, if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do so at cultcinemacircle@gmail.com. If you'd like to give any movie recommendations, give feedback on the show, or if you'd just like to say hey, I'm open to all of it. You can also follow the show on Instagram at cultcinemacircle and on Twitter at cultcinecircle. I tend to announce the movies that I'm going to be covering and just interact with people on there if they want. You can also follow me on Letterboxd at Jesse, Jesse, Kremp, Kremp, all one word. On that platform, I tend to log the movies that I watch. I write little stupid reviews about them and just general foolishness over there. Be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast on your podcatcher of choice, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm pretty much on all of them. Be sure to leave 5 stars and a 1 to 2 sentence review about the show so we can grow the audience and then just spread the love all around. Be sure to tune in next week to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast, where I'll be covering 1986's Night of the Creeps. In 1959, an alien experiment crashes to Earth and infects a fraternity member. They freeze the body, but in the modern day, 2 geeks pledging a fraternity accidentally thaw the corpse, which proceeds to infect the campus with parasites that transform their hosts into killer zombies. As always, thank you for taking the time to listen to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast, and remember, Mary Jane, oh Mary Jane, you conquered me like Charlemagne. Take care. Bye.